As a society, we are not definitely ready to be digitally hooked all the time, right? All of us are craving social company and social interaction and so on and so forth. So if you're able to address the social and emotional needs of children, I believe that we are naturally wired to learn, so children are like natural learners. I'm Natasha and I work in the education space. I've been working in this sector for about 10 years and I largely look at the public education system. But prior to that, I've worked with several multilateral and government initiatives, including being at Niti Aayog, which gave me like a really big sense of how the policy space works in India. And all of this is sort of helped by the fact that I was always interested in education. I did my master's at Harvard and I studied education, including policy and psychology, which is the kind of lens that I always apply to my work in education. So that's kind of where I come from. Now, in terms of the work that I'm most immediately associated with is in trying to understand how to improve the public education system, because while the private education has grown quite a lot, we still have in the elementary space, which is the 6 to 14-year-olds, you still have about 80 or almost about like 70% of children still go to government schools. And then at some point they transition into the private space. So if you look at that, that's almost 300 million children. And that's a large number that needs to be served with high quality education. Currently, that's not entirely the case. There are still a lot of gaps and deficits within the public schooling system. And it is those that I sort of work to address and try to understand how to improve. It's actually really just like a pyramid, right? Where the tip is your elite private schools. And the elite private schools are not just the extremely high fee schools, which maybe many of us might think of as elite, but it's even something your middle class children, for instance, also actually go into what we categorize as the elite private schools. Because therein, the private managements are relatively effective, the resources are pretty high for those children, and the family backgrounds that those children come from are also slightly high resource. Then we go into the kind of major government segment, which is your affordable private schools and your government schools. Affordable private schools are your kind of low-cost, low-fee private schools, which have mushroomed all over the country in the last decade to a large extent. But those are schools where, they are supposedly English medium, they charge fees from parents, but there isn't any evidence necessarily that the outcomes on learning are that much more better in the affordable private space. But it is an aspirational space, it is a space where typically parents who have even the slightest more affordability compared with, let's say, the really daily wage parents, they tend to send their children to the affordable private schools. And then we have this very, very large government school system. Truthfully, even the government school system is not homogeneous, because within the government you have your Kendriya Vidyalayas, you have your Jawahar Navodaya Vidyalayas, which are very high performing schools. Even in the secondary school space, some government schools actually do very well. But many government schools really suffer from a lack of funding and a lack of structure and so on and so forth. So what you have is that you have possibly the bottom of the pyramid. The poorest, most disenfranchised children actually end up in the government school system. And that's the kind of broad 300 million that I'm talking about. So it's like that. It's just very sharp at the top with the very elite schools. And then you have this very thick foundational pyramid, which accommodates a lot of other children. I think let's probably look at curriculum and technology as two different sort of strands, because in curriculum, I think there has been quite a lot of conversation about upgrading the education curriculum across the board. Even for elite private schools, it's been a big conversation of how to make it more skills-based, how to make it more future relevant, so on and so forth. There is this sense that, even our CBSE curriculum, for instance, needs to upgrade. So even that conversation was there even in the kind of elite space. It's also there in the government school space, where there was a increasing interest coming about from states on well-being, on social emotional learning. You had states like Delhi launching the happiness curriculum, you had states like Andhra announcing it, So there was this sort of wave that was coming about where people were realizing that the curriculum itself needs to change to become more relevant. And then there was the kind of technology influence where you were thinking that how do we integrate educational technology into learning? Again, across the board, I think this conversation's been it's been quite active. So within the, let's say, elite schools, I think some schools have managed to integrate technology very well, but my experience has been that many elite schools also continue with a fairly traditional method, and technology is just a sort of digitization of content, but not really digital pedagogy. So I don't think even elite schools had gotten to digital pedagogy. Many of them hadn't. And similarly, in the government school space as well, there is this understanding that there is a plethora of material online. Teachers should look at things online, students should look at things online. But it wasn't very clear as to what is the actual uptick of that and what is the connection between accessing resources online and learning. So that was actually where the conversation was. I think what has really changed now, of course, is that everybody kept talking about the potential of technology, but there was still a fair amount of inertia within the system to really change the way you integrate technology into education and really embrace that pedagogy. Then came the pandemic, and we know what happened after that. And now there is no choice but to sort of look at digital in a kind of digital first manner. So that is what's changed. But prior to that, there was a kind of runway for technology that had already been laid in terms of it being looked at as the next sort of promising thing. No, I mean, I would have to say that I think government school teachers are probably one of the hardest working teachers I have ever met. The government school officers are one of the hardest working officers. They work all the way till the night, and they don't have Saturdays and Sundays. They're all encumbered by a system that doesn't work in their favor. And I think very small examples are that, if you're a private school, you actually have the ability to recruit your own teachers, you have the ability to put them on performance management schemes. Here, there is absolutely no freedom to manage your own staff. You don't have the freedom to manage your own money. You get school grants and they're in very tight compartments. You have no ability. Sometimes even when very dynamic school principals in government schools have actually decided to raise funds from the community, they get a rap for it because they haven't figured out, how to use that money within those tight compartments. So I think that there is so much centralization and disempowerment of all the sort of key actors in the government school space that that is definitely the issue where, that empowerment piece is missing, the decentralization piece is missing. At the same time, I also think that if you look at the challenges of the government school system, I will never sort of forget this conversation I had with the Maharashtra Commissioner of Education. And I used to work at UNICEF at that time. And we were giving him some sort of, utopian, like, sir, but why don't you consider this? Or why don't you consider that? And he said, it's really easy for people who run private schools to, let's say, create very high standards of education or, do what they like. He said, because you can decide whether you want to open a school in a particular space, and you can decide which children you want to include, and you can decide what teachers you want to have. He said, but I am law-bound to open a school in the most remote district in an unviable geography, unviable terrain, where there will be only 4 children, and no teacher wants to go there. But I am law-bound to do that. I don't have a choice. It's not something that I sit and say, it doesn't look like it's a good idea, I shouldn't do it. I have to do it. So then when you look at that scale, right, where you have to run 1 lakh schools, where you have to, sort of provide uniforms for all these children, and anything you spend can come up for a PIL. Anybody can, put a court case against you. The scrutiny of the public on public funds in education is so high. So I think that it's all of these things that have really trapped the public education system in the quagmire that it's in. If you zoom into the micro, you will find tremendous examples of incredible teachers, bright students, wonderful principals, excellent officers, as islands of sort of excellence. But somehow it's not stitching together because the system, the waters, which is the system, is not enabling. So that's my view on the government school space. And what we do about it definitely is a leadership question. I think that it has to, because it's a very hierarchical top-down system, and our entire public administration, not just education, but like health, nutrition, all of it is so kind of top-driven. We do require some leadership shifts in the top and some maybe brighter visions, and it is going to take some time to shift that. No, that's a great question. I think that you're absolutely right in the sense that the big crisis in most of the public schools is one of learning. So it's been very clear for the last 5 or 10 years, even ever since Asar has been coming year on year and showing you that the learning levels have just flattened. And foundational learning became a really big clarion call, right? Where you're saying that children in the early grades just don't even develop foundational skills, and those skills are extremely vital for lifelong learning. So there was this tremendous interest and impetus around how do we build foundational skills. Here, I think there exists various schools of thought. There are people who say that yes, you need to take it on as a mission and really drive foundational skills. There were others who said that how about you try to see whether technology can be leveraged to just accelerate the acquisition of foundational skills. And I think that this is truthfully a debate. There are some successful models, there are some smaller scale models that have shown how you can leverage technology. But you're right, nobody thinks of technology as the sort of solution to the problem. It is simply a lever that can help you solve the problem. But the problem really is that children aren't able to acquire foundational skills. And most of it really boils down to teaching pedagogy and the abilities of teachers themselves. So the pandemic, it's really been a curved ball because I don't think anyone's ever experienced this degree of school closure. I think the pandemic moved in like 2 phases. We're in probably stage 2 and looking to go into stage 3, where the first stage was just nationwide school closures and a sense of complete shock and disorientation, with nobody having a sense of what to do, and children sitting at home, teachers sitting at home, and a lot of teachers were put on COVID duty. They were sent to borders to sort of do, temperature checks and so forth. So they were kind of deployed as the state machinery. Many of the teachers were doing ration checks. Many of the teachers were going house to house again, like asking, "Are you aware of COVID symptoms?" So teachers are always the foot soldiers, right? So they were sent to do that. That was phase 1, and children were possibly just doing whatever it is they had to do. Nobody was able to really come to grips with what's happening. Then naturally, the departments and government and civil society, NGOs have all sort of come together and started talking very aggressively about how do you continue to solve for learning when children are not coming to school. And so I think 2 things have emerged from this process right now in the public education system. I think the elite schools, we can also talk about what's happening there and the trends. But I think in the public space, one is that a lot of teachers are now getting trained and interacting and online. So there's a lot of thrust from all the states to sort of get their teachers kitted up on virtual sort of tools and get them to understand virtual pedagogy, digital resources, so on and so forth. So that's definitely one. The other is there is very serious questions around how do you push content to children. Within children, I think, definitely the high school segment is the priority. It's also the more kind of appropriate age for digital engagement. So I suppose we're mostly looking at middle school, high school grades in terms of pushing content. But access to technology continues to remain a huge challenge. While there are many reports talking about, mobile penetration in India, there are a lot of dynamics at play in terms of who the mobile belongs to, how much access do children even have, what is the gender dynamic there in terms of girls having access versus boys having access, what are some of the risks of giving children unfettered access to technology in that sense, so there's all of that stuff. And that's only when families have smartphones. There are many families that might have a smartphone but have limited data packs, have limited electricity. The parents are undergoing a fair amount of stress. So it's not even a conversation in the households right now in terms of, how do we drive learning? So that's where the space is right now, really trying to understand how to reach children, because what is known in research is that the more children stay out of school, there is this major slide. There's a learning slide in terms of a lot of loss of all of the work that you might have done over the last year. So it's almost like you'd have to not just start afresh, but almost you'd have to start 2 steps back. Governments are actually exploring slightly kind of old world technologies like radio and TV, SMS, IVRS. I've actually heard of somebody doing assessments via IVRS. They read you a question and then you press A, B, C, and they're trying to assess how much children know about different things through IVRS. So some very kind of 2G technologies you're seeing are kind of being resurrected in the wake of the fact that actually our tech is not where it needs to be in order to drive some of the more new age tools. So that is some of the things government's actually looking at very actively. Sometimes it's good to realize that there is a whole world out there that has very different considerations and that has very different, and it's not like, and you will find geniuses and success stories and enormous bright sparks, innovators, entrepreneurs from all of those government schools as well, right? So life isn't just about all of the inputs you get. And just because some kids are getting a lot of like tech-based online learning and others are not, doesn't mean that these kids will succeed and these won't. So I think that's also really important to realize that there is a life outside of curriculums and academia, which is the life that I think a lot of parents, probably if they really think about it, they might have experienced it during the lockdown period, that you will see how your children have maybe become more empathetic, right? As a result of being at home. I mean, I know of stories where kids are realizing how much their parents work. I mean, kids are becoming more interested in cooking. Some of them are getting interested in gardening. These are all enormous life skills, which sometimes we deprioritize, So I would say that just maybe having that handle might be a little bit useful, as this reality looks like it may be around for a while, right? I mean, we may not be able to send our children to school anytime soon. Our children may not, there are parents whose kids were supposed to start university, now we don't know. Maybe they'll start it remotely, right? But I think that's the thing to know, that there are many, many children out there who have even much less, but they're also happy, and, they are also sort of, you have to kind of realize your own access and your own privileges. It's sort of what I'd say, but I don't know, I don't really know what that takeaway is truthfully for affluent parents. I don't know. To them, I think the message is just more different, which is to say that if there's a lot of anxiety around online education, then, support the schools and play your part in it. And don't be too anxious on behalf of your children and their future. But if there is a sense that your children are not getting enough, then know that they are much, much ahead of what other children have, right? So you're already, and we know that digital is only expanding that kind of inequity, right? So I think we should all be a little bit aware of how much our children will continue to be caught up and how far behind many other children will get left, right? So we want to think about the part we can play, maybe going forward in some way, bridging that through our businesses, through our advocacy, whatever it is. I think that is really important. Maybe that's the message.